What really stands out for me is the first time I held a wild bird in my hand. I had been feeding birds in my yard and watching birds kind of casually, but my friend and then neighbor Jennifer had started with the banding program at the herd, and she had been pestering me to come with her. And because I'm not really much of an early morning person, it took a while for her to convince me it was something I needed to do. But when I finally did go with her, the first day I visited, I was, of course, just an observer at that point. But they let me release a bird that had been banded and weighed and measured and so on. And the minute I held that wild bird in my hand, I was hooked and kept coming ever since and got trained in how to do the process and everything. And now I'm the master permit holder. The master permit holder is the person who's responsible for the operation of the banding station. And that means everything that happens there is ultimately my responsibility. And the other people who have had sufficient training and experience are sub-permitted under me. In order to get a master permit, there has to be some evidence that you're going to do something with your data. Just because you like to hold birds isn't a good enough reason to ban birds. So at our banding station, we're tracking migration trends and population trends, but we are also participating in a study that's being done by the Institute for Tropical Studies at UCLA. And when we can, we will extract two tail feathers from the birds that we banned and send them into UCLA along with the information on the age and the sex and the species of the bird and the band number. And they do DNA analysis on those feathers, and that helps them to that helps researchers who use the data to determine relationships of these individual birds with other birds of their species and kind of tracks where the populations are moving and spreading. And they also do stable isotope analysis that analyzes what the birds have been feeding on. And it's a way for them to know where the birds have been feeding, because from one region to another, plant species or worm species or insect species vary, and so they can tell where the birds have been feeding. So if we've captured a bird in Texas and they've been feeding somewhere else entirely, they can determine that from that stable isotope data. I want to stress that what we do does not harm the bird. We're very, very careful. We do everything we can to ensure their safety and their well-being. And that is the primary thing of the Bander's Code of Ethics. Your data doesn't count nearly as much as the safety of that bird. The thing about banding birds, we do it because you can learn a great deal of things about bird populations by banding. You can observe birds and count birds, but by examining the birds closely and taking these measurements and determining their age and their condition and that kind of thing, we can supply a great deal of data to researchers, and it helps when we capture a bird and band it. Maybe it'll be recaptured at another banding station, so we know where these birds are going. Or if someone reports a banded bird that they found, we can help determine their migration paths, their populations, whether they're in decline or not. Birds are very territorial, as you know, when they're breeding, but they're kind of faithful to the sites where they feed when they're migrating. We recapture the same individual birds year after year during migration, when they're on their way to their breeding grounds in the north or when they're on their way to their wintering grounds in South America. The same birds come through the herd sanctuary over and over. And so it's kind of interesting because it also helps you determine how long birds live. We have a cardinal that we've captured 12 times since 97, and at the last point it was more than 8 years old. The oldest bird on record with the BBL was 15 years and 9 months old. And who would know that a bird lived that long if someone hadn't banded it as a nestling? It's interesting to me that the different species have very distinct personalities. You've probably heard chickadees and titmice scolding when you've been out in the woods. They do that when you have them in hand. They just keep up a litany of complaints the whole time you have them in your hands. And some birds, the flycatchers, for example, become so still that you worry that you've lost them, but they're playing possum. And there are other birds who, as soon as you pick them up, they'll poop in your hand. So they do have really distinct personalities. Most of the birds we ban, unless we recapture them ourselves, we don't really know where they go or what happens to them. And for the most part, when someone reports a banded bird that they found it because the bird is dead. It's flown into a window. It's been hit by a car. And so we were very excited that a bird that we banded during winter banding 2 years ago, a goldfinch, was recaptured at another banding station in Ontario, Canada. We were so excited when that happened. We also tried to do demonstrations for children. Our environment, our wild animals and birds are going to depend on the stewardship of these people who are children now. So we want them to have an interest in conservation so that they'll grow up to be mindful of the things that need to be done to protect our environment.